Okay, so I'm still getting used to this new software, so hi everybody. This is going to be a lecture in place of the missed class. First recording I didn't take, I put online, and then I made a second recording, and that didn't take. This is try number 3. If I sound a little bit tired giving this talk, it's because now this is the 3rd time in a row I've given this talk, so uh, I am sorry for this. But this lecture is going to be in place of the lecture that we would have normally had in class, but that is canceled due to the storm. Your quiz has been moved to Thursday, so you don't take into account that this lecture is a little bit late going up. So hopefully this will record okay. I am going to start the lecture now. We're going to talk about Chapter 14, Social Psychology. So in 2011, the Vancouver Stanley Cup riot happened. In 2011, the Canucks lost in Game 7 to the Bruins in the Stanley Cup playoffs. About 140 people reported as injured. One was critically injured. These 4 people stabbed. It's a pretty bad scene. Police cars flipped over, set on fire. And as of 2013, police have recommended about 1,200 criminal charges against 350 suspected rioters. It's a pretty big deal. And it kind of raises the question, why do people engage in these sorts of violent behaviors? Are sports fans barbarians? Is it maybe that we behave differently in crowds? What sort of factors of crowds might make normal people do these abnormal things? These are the questions that social psychology asks. We want to see how other people influence our behavior. Well, the principle that we're seeing here in the riots, when you see this sort of mob mentality, is a principle known as de-individuation. The loss of individuality that leads to disinhibited behavior. Now, in this case, anonymity is the key factor. So it's this combination of anonymity and being in a crowd that can lead to disinhibited behavior. So disinhibited behavior is, you losing your regular inhibitions and doing things you wouldn't regularly do. It's this combination of the crowd and anonymity that's key. So Zimbardo did this study, and he did a bunch of different studies. We'll talk about one of his others as well. And he wanted to see if people were more likely to give shocks to a helpless woman if disguised. So you could give shocks to another person in his studies, and much like the Milgram study that we talked about previously. And some people would just do this if they had the opportunity because they like to hurt other people, or they get some sort of gratification of the power that it gives them. The thing is that people aren't likely to shock another human being if they're staring them right in the eye and they know that they did it. Right? But if you put them in these sort of crazy looking costumes, you can see these costumes here where the participants have like bags over their head. You can barely tell that they're humans. They hide their identity. Right? Now, when you put people in these costumes, they're more likely to engage in antisocial behaviors. In other words, when you put people in these costumes, they're more likely to give the shocks out. They can give these shocks because people don't know who they are. So they're both in a crowd of other people, so it could be any of the other people in the group, and you're anonymous. People can't tell who you are. They can't even tell your gender or your size because you're in these sort of bag-like costumes. And you can think about like Halloween with children. So imagine you put out a bowl of candy, and then you just say, "Free, take one." Now, you think that a lot of kids might steal some of that candy, right? Now, kids will, but as it turns out, if a kid's alone and they're wearing a costume where they're identifiable, as they're wearing like a costume without a mask, not that many kids steal the candy. Maybe a little less than 10%. You put a mask on that kid and he comes up alone, maybe about 20% of those kids will steal that candy. Similarly, you get a group of kids with and that they're all identifiable, so they're wearing costumes where you can tell who they are. That group of kids, maybe about 20% of the kids will steal candy. That is, they'll take more than their fair share. They'll take more than one. But you get a bunch of kids together in masks in a large group, it shoots way up. You see, more than 50% of kids will steal candy when they are both anonymous and in groups. So when you see this group of anonymous mask-wearing kids, they're more likely to just take a whole bunch of that candy and shove it in their pockets. This is because it's demonstrating the principle of de-individuation. That is, you have the combination of anonymity and being in a large group, which leads to This inhibited an antisocial behavior, in this case, stealing. Another more serious topic is the topic of baiting and suicides. You may not know this, but a lot of people in larger cities, when they choose to commit suicide, they will do so by stepping out onto a roof and jumping to their death. What you might not know too is that in many of these cases, a lot of reported accounts, you'll have people in the crowd who are baiting. Baiting is essentially encouraging the person to jump or to kill themselves. A truly horrific antisocial behavior. Well, does this follow the same sort of pattern of de-individuation we've seen in the previous examples? Now, you can't study this experimentally, obviously. You have to use archival data. In this case, the researcher used newspapers. They studied newspaper articles. So when somebody kills himself or attempts suicide, it usually makes the news. So they would read the accounts of what happened. And what they found is crowds are more likely to encourage suicide victims engage in baiting when it's dark, when it's past 6 p.m. When it's nighttime, it's dark. People can't see you. You have your anonymity. Even if you say something awful and there's someone in the crowd who disagrees with you and would tell you to shut up and not say that awful thing, they can't pinpoint who it is. So you maintain your anonymity. And when there's a large crowd together along with it, you get this de-individuation. Once one person starts doing it, then conformity principles start kicking in. Once the conformity principles start kicking in, then everybody starts doing it. So they did this analysis and they found, when you look at the data, non-baiting before 6 p.m., when it was earlier in the day, it almost never was the baiting, but after 6 p.m., it was more likely for that to occur. So this shows the same pattern where antisocial behavior occurs, the combination of large crowds and anonymity. And talk a little bit about social norms next. Getting into more of Zimbardo's work. So social norms are the shared expectations about how you should think, feel, and behave. So about, being quiet in class, raising your hand when you want to ask a question, holding the door open for somebody who's a certain amount of feet behind you before they come through. It's all part of the social norms. They regulate your behavior. You do these things sort of automatically. Nobody has to tell you about these things because they're norms and they're shared among most people in a given culture or society. Social roles are a specific set of norms that are supposed to characterize how a certain person or a certain role behaves. There's a way a person ought to behave. So how a teacher ought to behave, a police officer, a prison guard should behave. You have a set of beliefs about how, or norms that apply to certain groups. These are known as social roles. Now, the thing is that some people will do things in a social role that they might not otherwise do. That's what Zimbardo wanted to study. Now, the Stanford Prison Study was in 1971 and was a pretty intense study. And I'll show you a brief video of it. But in this study, 24 people are assigned to be prisoners or guards. They observed how they adapted to social roles. You should note that this study is relatively unethical. It happened in the period before modern ethics boards, which came out around the mid-70s. So this study predated modern research ethics boards. I'll let you take a look at the video. Hopefully you'll be able to hear the sound. I'm not sure if you will on this casting, but I guess we're about to find out. I'm also going to check that my broadcast is still on because I'd rather not lose it for a third time. All right, so let's take a look at the video. So you could go on and watch the rest of it. I do recommend you do if you're interested in the topic and learning more about it. It's pretty powerful stuff. But it's an illustration of the power of social roles. People believed that prison guards ought to behave in a certain way based on their preconceptions, and they behaved in ways that they may not normally have actually done in their day-to-day life because they were placed in these roles. I'm going to move on now to talk about social relations. Let's talk about prejudice and stereotypes. So what's the difference between a prejudice and discrimination, and what are the roots of prejudice? We'll talk about two theories that describe why prejudice exists, what perpetuates it. So you can make this distinction between prejudice and discrimination. So prejudice is a negative attitude towards people based on their membership in a group, so prejudging people. So let's pick, I'll call them purple people because that's not an existing stereotype of people. I don't want to use one right now. But so if you think purple people are stupid and lazy, then you have this attitude about them. So you prejudge somebody. So before you know, once you know that about them, you think they're going to be stupid and lazy before you know anything else about them. You're judging them based on the purpleness of their skin. Discrimination now may involve prejudice, it may be conscious or may be unconscious, but it's about overt behavior. It's about treating people unfairly based on the group in which they belong. Now, you may be aware of this. You may dislike purple people and you think that they're stupid and lazy. And then you go, when you have the possibility to bring them into a job interview, you're like, it's a purple person. I'm not going to invite them because I know they're stupid and lazy. That would be discrimination combined with prejudice. You believe that, and that's the other thing. Now, you may not deliberately do this. If you still discriminate against purple people based on the color of their skin, even if you're not prejudiced, you'd still be engaging in discrimination. So they two tend to go hand in hand, but you can sometimes have discrimination in the absence of prejudice. There's usually a sort of systemic discrimination in that case. Stereotypes are a sort of prototype. They're sort of overly simplified prototype of a particular group of people, and prototype used in the cognitive psychology sense, and that sort of like this idealized form that most quickly comes to mind when you think of a particular category. And they have some kernel of truth to them, otherwise they wouldn't be effective and they wouldn't catch on the way that they do, but they tend to be so grossly oversimplified that when applied to an individual life, they're not very useful. And that stereotypes are usually the prototypes that are held and that perpetuate prejudice. What are the roots of prejudice? These are two theories that help explain prejudice. We have realistic conflict theory and social identity theory. Realistic conflict theory proposes that competition for resources fosters prejudice. So in other words, prejudice exists because there are finite resources. A common thing that you'll hear people talk about in the United States today is people will say that Mexicans are stealing our jobs, and then they fight against immigrants, and they're prejudiced against Mexicans because they believe there's a finite resource, aka jobs, and that the Mexicans are taking them. And that's what fosters and promotes their prejudice, is this competition for limited resources. So if there was no competition for resources, everybody could have a job, then there would presumably, according to realistic conflict theory, be no prejudice. Alternatively, you can do the opposite of conflict or competition. You can engage in cooperation. So by getting people to cooperate towards a single goal that they both want. You can get these two opposed groups that hate each other to work together for a common goal, then hypothetically, prejudice should decrease according to realistic conflict theory, because cooperation is essentially the opposite of competition, and competition is what's driving prejudice. A social identity theory is different. It suggests that some people tie their identity to a social group, whether it be a social sports team or a political group. And we rely on the accomplishments of the in-group, the group that you attach to your identity to improve your own sense of self-worth. For instance, then maybe you're a strong conservative, and then when the Conservative Party succeeds or gets elected, you vicariously feel happy because your in-group is succeeding. So the successes of your group are like successes for you. Where the prejudice comes in when you tie your social identity to these groups is that any threat to the group is treated as a threat to your own self-esteem. Now, when your self-esteem, when somebody attacks you, makes fun of you, says something bad to you, you often lash out. That's a normal human behavior. But social identity theory, what also can happen is when people lash out at your group, when they criticize your group, it is like a criticism of you. And then you're able to lash out defensively against your out group, the people not, or the example I'm giving her, are not conservatives. Maybe they are liberals or NDPs. And prejudice arises from the defensive reactions when your group is targeted, so that we derogate other groups to make ourselves feel better, and we get happy when our group and lash out when people attack our own group. So social identity theory broadly is derogating other groups and making our own group seem good as a means of protecting our own self-esteem. Robbers Cave experiment is one of the most famous experiments in social psychology, and it was done quite a while ago. And you can read the full study there on that web link at the bottom, but it's designed as a test of realistic conflict theory. So they bring 22 kids to sort of a summer camp for scouts. So, you go in the woods and cabins and you play games and do these sorts of things. Oh, they separate them into two groups. Now, at first, the two groups didn't know each other. You have two groups of 11 kids. And they're encouraged to go together in their separate camps and bond together. And they name their groups. They give themselves like a team name. So one group was the Eagles. The other group was the Rattlers. So the Eagles and the Rattlers at first didn't know of each other's existence. They were on the same campground, but they were far enough away they didn't know the other group of kids was there. Then what do? Well, you pit the kids against each other in tournament-style activities. So you make them fight tug of war and baseball and other sorts of competitive activities. Now, you tie these competitive activities to a prize. So you want to give the kids a prize, but only the kids who win, only the team who wins. So the team who wins will get a trophy and a Swiss Army knife. A Swiss Army knife is like for a 10, 13-year-old boy is like, oh boy, that is a good prize. And the kid's really going to want that. If he doesn't get that, he's going to be pretty unhappy. So that's a limited resource though. Right? So only some may have knives. The losers get nothing. You can see this will become relevant in a moment that they make little flags or banners for their own team as well. They're encouraged to make these flags. And you can see this is the flag for the Eagles here. Well, what happens, of course, eventually the Eagles lose, and it was actually after a baseball match, and then they don't get the Swiss Army knives, and then the Rattlers get it. And I'm going to read this quote from the paper. So, finally, someone suggested to the Eagles go back to their cabin. Lane started off first and noticed the Rattlers' flag on the ball field battle stop. He yelled that he could take it down. All the Eagles ran for the backstop, Craig trying to knock down the flag and climbing up to take it down. Mason grabbed it and tried with the help of others to tear it up. Someone suggested, let's burn it. Oh boy. So Mason, Craig, and McGraw found some matches somewhere, set the flag on fire. Mason held it while it burned and swung it back and forth, and he decided to hang the scorched remnant back up. Craig did so, and the boys sang Taps. It's a popular song at the time. Mason said, you can tell those guys I did it. If they say anything, I'll fight them. Oh boy, that sounds an awful lot like political conflicts you'd see happening in almost any part of the world, with the flag burning all included. Well, it sounds like their manipulation worked. They're definitely getting hostility between the groups, probably also prejudice that the Eagles sure as heck don't like those Rattlers very much at all, especially after losing. Well, of course, that's not all there is to the study. So they've successfully shown that they can engender prejudice in the people, but that wouldn't be a very great study to take a bunch of kids and make them hate each other and send them home, right? So there was another part to the study. Stage 3 is where you engineer situations so the two groups are forced to work together towards a larger goal, that they're forced to cooperate. Remember, in realistic conflict theory, it posited that cooperation is the opposite of competition, and by getting people to cooperate, you can eliminate the source of the prejudice and hostility. Well, what they engineered was, they actually engineered a few different scenarios. This is the one I'm going to talk about, was a reservoir. The water reservoir, they said vandals came and destroyed the reservoir. We don't have any water. We don't have any water to drink. We don't have any water to take a shower. The camp counselors say, if we can't fix this, everybody's going to have to go home. Well, the kids are forced to work together. They have to push a heavy log down over to the side, and they can climb up to see if there's any water left in it. They find that there is, and then they explore it some more, and eventually they find a sack that's sort of stuffed into the faucet, and then with some work and some help and cooperation, they can fix the problem. What happens after that is miraculous. Once the kids work together, after a few repeated tasks, that initial hostility and prejudice disappears. The kids start to intermingle. They start to become friends in different groups. And by the end of the time they're going home, many of the friends are smiling and laughing and waving at each other. No more burning flags and saying they're going to fight them. They've become friends, or at least as friends as you would be at a summer camp. It's quite fascinating. It shows that they can reverse the very situation that they engendered by introducing competition by creating a cooperation format. We'll talk a little bit about aggression too. So aggression is violent behavior intended to cause psychological, physical harm, or both to another being, usually in the context of what we're talking about to humans, but harming animals would count as aggression as well. Now, direct aggression includes things like physical aggression, so like punching, hitting, shoving, and the like, but also includes like directly getting in somebody's face and directing verbal aggression towards somebody. So if you say to somebody like, I really hate you, and you yell at them and you get in their face and you make their life difficult, you're directly taking your anger, you're directing at the other person, you're saying nasty things to them, they know it's you that's saying them, and you're trying to hurt them with your words. That's still direct aggression. Okay. Indirect aggression is where you try to hurt someone else, but put one step of deniability in between who's doing it. Okay. So sometimes it's called relational aggression, but indirect aggression is probably a better name for it. So these are things like gossip, spreading rumors, social exclusion. So you're mad at your friend, and direct aggression would be you go up to them and you give them a piece of your mind and you yell at them, or maybe you punch them in the face because they said something you really hated. That's direct aggression. Indirect aggression is like, well, no, you talk to your friends and you spread some nasty rumors about them, and you gossip behind their back. And then you start to work on getting their friends to socially exclude them. You kind of give them the cold shoulder over time, and then maybe you don't invite them to a party or something like that, but you take lots of pictures and you post it on Facebook, and you make sure that they see and know that they weren't invited, and you make them feel socially excluded. Now you have deniability that you've done this because you put a space in between you and the other person, but you're still trying to hurt the other person, but you're hurting them from a distance, and you're hurting them indirectly. And it's pretty well known that men engage in a lot more direct aggression than women do. Though there's also a decent literature to suggest that women are more likely to engage in indirect aggression when they do engage in it. All that said, though, my take on the literature of what I've read so far is that I do think that there's a tendency for women to be more likely to engage in indirect aggression, but the literature suggests that the effect may not be as large as you might think, and that women engage both in indirect and direct aggression. A lot of the studies of indirect aggression are done in adolescence. In adolescence, I think it's probably fair to say a lot of girls or women are more likely to engage in indirect aggression. There's a few different correlates of aggression. You might think of provocation, of course. So when somebody says something to provoke you, to say something mean to you, then you're more likely to engage in aggression. So if somebody punches you, you'll punch them back. If they yell at you, you yell at them back. That's pretty straightforward. But other things can do it. Crowding can do it. Crowding increases aggression. Crowding increases our stress response. So when you're in a large crowd, cortisol, the stress hormones all start rushing through your body. That fight or flight response activates and we get stress. This happens usually without your consent. But then when you combine that high stress plus the behavioral disinhibition that comes in crowds, that de-individuation, you can see more violence, more aggression happen because you're both stressed out and your behavior is disinhibited. So you're more likely to actually snap and hurt somebody. Heat can do it. Population research shows that more aggressive crimes are in the hot summer months. And I mean, you probably all experienced at some point in your life being extra grumpy because you're really hot. It puts you in a bad mood. But being in a bad mood makes you more likely to aggress. And that's shown in the population data and the data you get from police departments. And the social learning theory. This is observing others engage in aggression so that they're rewarded for them. So this is you remember that Bandura. This is if you go back to social learning theory, he proposed that we observe a model engaging in a behavior, and we're more likely to emulate the behavior of that model if they're getting a reward. So say you watch a bully beat someone up, take their lunch money. They don't get any punishment for it, they get some lunch money out of it. Your social learning theory would suggest you're more likely to do that because you've observed it, you've observed somebody getting a reward and getting no punishment, so you're more likely to emulate that behavior to get the reward. The jury's still out on whether or not this social learning applies to media, like movies and violent video games. What is known is that they're positively correlated with each other. That is, people who tend to be more aggressive and violent tend to watch violent media sources. That says it doesn't seem like it's a causal relationship. It seems the most likely conclusion, based on my take on the literature, is that people who have a tendency to be violent tend to prefer to watch these are violent media rather than the violent media causing the aggression via social learning processes. All that said, though, you should know that that is still relatively debated by some people and still under study, and not everybody would agree with that standpoint. Let's talk next about pro-social behavior. Pro-social behavior is interesting in a wide variety of ways. Why do we help other people? It's an interesting behavior from an operant conditioning standpoint because you're essentially doing a behavior without getting any obvious reward. And operant conditioning would suggest that we only really do things when we get rewards, that we do behaviors more often when we're rewarded and less often when we're punished. And pro-social behavior is essentially sacrificing something of yourself to help somebody else without any obvious benefit to yourself. So it's an interesting behavior from a psychological standpoint. Well, let's start first from why people sometimes don't help others. This is something commonly studied in social psychology called the bystander effect. And it's about the tendency for people to not intervene when they are a bystander when a crowd is large. That is, the larger the crowd, the less likely somebody is to uh, help another person. And the process by which this occurs is something called the diffusion responsibility. I'm going to show you this first video first, and if you're sensitive to these sorts of things, you might want to skip ahead in the video. It's a person gets hit by a car. The only reason it's not gory or there's no blood or anything of that sort, but it's a security video. The reason I'm showing you it um, is because I want you to watch the crowd in a real life situation. Watch how long it takes the crowd to intervene and do something. There is no sound in this video normally. You can notice once one person goes over, quite a lot more go over. But it takes quite a while for that very first person to arrive on the scene. And it's many people in the background walk past and don't even look up or don't engage or do anything. This kind of scenario, and this is actually a pretty good one where people are engaged pretty fast. Sometimes it can go even longer than that. I'm going to show you another video, and this is a more experimental paradigm where they use a Confederate calling out for help. Long video. Right. So you can see it took 20 minutes for that first guy to get uh, rescued. This is an illustration of the bystander effect. People have done this sort of study for quite a long time in social psychology. You can continue to find it. Um, in large crowds, when people need help, people often never receive any help. What determines whether or not we do decide to help someone or not? Well, if you want to help somebody, if you're ever going to engage and help the bystanders, you have to engage in these 5 steps. So you have to say yes to all 5 steps if you decide to help someone. The first is you actually have to notice it. You have to actually get into your senses. You have to, if you never actually noticed the person, you walked by them and you literally didn't see them, well, then you definitely can't help. So you have to notice it first. So that rules out a whole bunch of people who are just not very perceptive. And you have to interpret it as an emergency. If you don't think it's an emergency, you're not going to help. You know, if somebody's just lying there on the ground and you think that they're sleeping or having a nap, you're like, oh, that's not an emergency. It'd be really embarrassing if I went up and I tried to help and it was an emergency, so I'm not going to help. It's not really an emergency. Well, say you do say it's an emergency. It's like, okay, well, that's pretty weird for them to be sleeping on the ground out in the rain, so it must be an emergency. Then you have to assume responsibility for helping. Here's where diffusion of responsibility comes in. Is it your responsibility to help? Well, technically, it's everybody's responsibility who's in the immediate area to help. And if nobody else is doing it, then why should you? Beyond that, if you don't help them, maybe you'll think, well, if I don't do it, somebody else surely will. Look at all the people are here. So I'm not going to take on this responsibility. Someone else will do it. Thing is, everybody thinks that. Everybody thinks that someone else will do the thing, will take responsibility. And in that way, nobody does. Now, even if you manage to push on past diffusion of responsibility, you have to know how to help. If you don't know how to help, you can't help. So if somebody's like, oh, I don't know if is like, is the person dead? Are they wounded? Do I know how to help? Maybe somebody's wounded on the side of the road and you're like, I don't know how to help them. I don't have first aid. I don't know what I can do. If you don't know how you can help, you won't help. In the context out there, a lot of people might have thought, it's like, well, I don't know, maybe this guy's just a drug addict and I don't know how to help that. You know, I can't give him drugs. I can't really solve the problem. He's just having withdrawal symptoms. There's not really much I can do to help. So you don't help. Then maybe you do know how to help. Maybe you do know the things, the places you could go, what you could, the resources you can connect them to. You think, I don't want to get involved. You have to decide to help anyway. You have to make that last decision, even if you know how to help. You may decide you don't want to risk getting a contagious disease. You don't want to risk getting injured. Maybe it's a trap. Maybe somebody's setting that up and you're going to get mugged. Or maybe they have gang connections and you don't want to get involved in those sorts of things. So you decide not to help anyway. You have to say yes to all 5 of these things to help. And diffusion of responsibility, one of the social psychological processes we talk to, affects step number 3, assuming responsibility for helping. There's also theories of altruism. I'll talk about each of these briefly, but you can refer to your textbook for more details. You have kin selection theory. That's an evolutionary theory. Explains why we help our family, why we engage in pro-social behaviors to help our family. It's because that we tend to favor genes that prompt basically your kin or your family shares genetics with you. To the extent that your family survives and goes on to produce other offspring, then your genes will propagate. In other words, they will be passed on to the next generation. To the extent that that happens, that's evolutionarily adaptive, according to these theorists. And thus, you're more likely to help your family because it propagates your genes and would be evolutionarily adaptive to do so. And that the fact that we are altruistic to other people is sort of like a carryover effect from this tendency to help our families, and it's sort of like a byproduct of this kin selection procedure. Reciprocal altruism, it's like you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. You're helping others. It's like an investment for the future. You're helping others with the hope that when you'll need help later, they will help you. So it's getting a sort of reward out of it. It's like investing, though, in the future and hoping for a better future for yourself by helping others. Social exchange theory is based on positive reinforcement. So it suggests that people engage in altruistic behaviors in order to in order to achieve positive reinforcement. So The idea is that you'll help others when the benefit outweighs the costs. Because when you do something good for someone, you do get something. You don't get nothing, right? So you get praise a lot of the time, maybe some social status, maybe a warm, fuzzy, positive emotions that come along with donating. So you donate $5 to charity because $5 is not much of a cost to you, but the positive emotions that you will get from donating and the praise and the thanks you'll get from the person who's standing by the donation bin is enough to outweigh the costs, therefore you do it. So that's what's known as social exchange theory. It's kind of selfish. There's a theory that altruism really is actually not altruistic at all, but is in fact partially selfish. The empathy altruism hypothesis suggests that we are good at recognizing emotions in other people. We know this from the research that we did on emotions displayed in people's nonverbal behavior, especially on their face. So then other people experience emotions, you're more likely to be, you can kind of vicariously experience them yourself. That is, when someone else is sad, you feel sad. When they're afraid, you feel a little bit afraid. And that we often don't like these negative emotions, and that when we see negative emotions in others, it makes us feel bad. Some process, sometimes people call that emotional contagion. So to the extent that you feel empathy for other people, that you can put yourself in their shoes, you can feel the sort of emotions, you help other people, because by helping other people, you make your own negative mood go away. That you feel bad to see their suffering. By alleviating your suffering, you no longer feel bad. So you're reinforced through negative reinforcement, taking away a negative emotion. So we should also talk a little bit about forming close relationships. So this came from sociology originally, but is applicable to social psychology. There's three features of relationships that promote development of friendships and romantic relationships: proximity or propinquity, repeated unplanned interactions, and a setting that encourages people to let their guard down and confide in each other. So proximity is essentially just the fact that you're more likely to get in relationships with people that are in your immediate physical environment. That you're more likely to make friends with at the places you work at, or at school, the people you go to class with, or you go to the gym with. All these people, you're more likely to make a friend with them than people that go to different universities, go to different places. So the closer they are in physical proximity to you, the more likely you are to actually end up in a relationship with them. This is, in terms of psychological processes, could be in part due to mere exposure. That is, to the extent of being exposed to the same stimulus over and over again, neutral stimuli anyway, usually you come to improve your liking of it. It's like when you listen to a song the first time, maybe you're kind of neutral, but you hear it over and over, sometimes you like it a little bit more. So mostly it's just about, it's easier to form relationships with people that are close. In physical proximity, I mean. Repeated unplanned interactions is important. So when you go to the gym or you go to work and you might talk to a person, you never plan to talk to them, but you have these short interactions, and each short interaction is an opportunity to make relationships, to become closer to people. And each time you have a chance to become closer, to become a friend, to become a romantic partner with someone. So the more opportunity you have for these unplanned interactions, the more likely you are to get in a relationship. Because you know how hard it is to like straight up ask somebody out for coffee or ask somebody out on a date. When you have these repeated unplanned interactions, it makes that easier and easier to talk to people and form relationships. And finally, settings that let you confide in each other. This is probably why so many undergraduate students form close relationships over a few drinks. Well, because drinks reduce your inhibitions and allow people to confide in the things that they're worried about and that they care about and that are important, and make them vulnerable. Now, it's important, of course, that when you share your vulnerability, that the other person doesn't ridicule or denigrate you. But when they are accepting, like you tell them something bad that's happening, like, man, that's okay. Or like, man, that's awful. I feel really bad for you. You know, it's like, that's tough. This promotes positive feelings between people. Right? And it promotes not only in the person who's confiding, but also in the person who's listening. Both become closer to each other. It's this sort of paradox of relationships, that on one hand, you may want to hide your imperfections from others and hide your vulnerabilities, but it's precisely the expressing of those vulnerabilities that leads to closer relationships in many cases. So I want to move from that to talk about similarity and attraction, an area that I was interested in during my master's research and continue to be interested in to some extent today. And We've known that birds of a feather flock together. Similarity attracts. Okay, this is a literature that goes back over 100 years in many different areas, in sociology to anthropology to psychology. And it's this phenomenon that social networks are more homogenous than you would expect due to chance. In other words, when you look at your friends and your romantic partners, the people that you know, they tend to be more similar to you in race, age, socioeconomic status, physical appearance, attractiveness. Not necessarily attitudes, but a lot of attitudes, say like political attitudes. If you look at social network research, places like Twitter and Facebook, you'll find that people pretty clearly curate their feeds to be people who are on the same wavelength politically as them. So you'll see that social networks are more similar than you would expect due to chance. People are similar in a wide array of features. All of these seem to have different processes. So race is different than attractiveness, which is different than political attitudes. They all have different rationales behind them, but the overall finding is pretty consistent. It's that similarity attracts. That people tend to be more similar. Their social networks are more homogenous than you'd expect. Early study I did way back in my master's degree. And if you're interested in this topic, I get students to actually replicate studies 1 and 2 as part of your field research component of psychology 3082 experimental social psych. So if you like this stuff and you come and do that class, provided I'm still doing that exercise at the time, we'll do that sort of exercise in the class. So the idea, I wanted to see how processes, and I thought that maybe part of the way that people may end up in relationships with people who look more physically similar to them, seating distance or seating preferences. That is, when you choose to sit by a stranger, all else held equal, you would prefer to sit by a stranger that looks like you. This may not be a conscious bias, although it may. And I kind of came by this nonchalantly. I was on the bus one day and a guy sits down with him and he's got a beard and glasses and brown hair. And I'm like, that's weird. But then it happens again. So I'm looking around and women sitting by other women and people with glasses sitting by people with other glasses. And people seemed to be more similar than you would expect just due to chance alone. But I wanted to test this experimentally. So I went on and I observed locations. I observed computer labs, first-year university classrooms, and all these different things. I kind of creeped around and I drew where people were sitting and I'd code whether they were wearing glasses or they're male or female or they had blonde hair or whatnot. And what I found in these studies is that people tended to sit by others who are more similar to them than you would expect due to chance. That is, men sat by other men, women by women, white people by other white people, people with glasses by people with other glasses, people with blonde hair by other people with blonde hair, and so on. So the effect was modest for some of the effects. It was actually pretty strong for something like race and sex. But it was more, it's not like destiny. It's not like, it's like, well, you can only sit by somebody that looks exactly like you. But these patterns were more than you would expect than chance. That is, if people were just sitting randomly, if physical appearance wasn't a concern, then you shouldn't have seen the patterns that I saw, at least mathematically speaking. I also did a study 3 where I took a Confederate. You'll remember a Confederate is a research assistant working with a psychologist. Very common in social psychology. So I get my Confederate, she's working with me, and I set up the experiment, and the real participants think that, well, okay, I'm going to come into this experiment, and they expect to come in and have to talk to somebody in a videotaped interview, another participant. The 2 participants will come in at a time. I rig it, and when I go to get the participant, I always say, it's like, oh, the other participant, my Confederate, was there early, so come on into the lab. They're already there waiting. I bring them into the lab, and when I get there, I go, oh, crap, forgot all my notes. Could you just pull up a chair there, and I'll be back in a moment. Now, I always say this because what I want them to do is I want to see how close they choose to sit to the Confederate. So they pick up a chair and they place it somewhere in proximity to the Confederate. Then we go through the rest of the study, which is kind of a filler distractor task. Okay, get them to do the interview, and then they go away into some cubicles and they do some other tasks. While they're in the cubicles, I measure the distance between the chairs. Right, I record it in centimeters. And later, I get pictures of both the Confederate and the person participating, and I get other coders to rate how physically similar they look to one another. So using this index of physical similarity, I found a positive correlation between seating distance and physical similarity. That is, the more physically similar that people looked to my Confederate, the closer they sat. That provided the same kind of evidence I found before, except using a contrived observation. So the idea then is that people sit physically similar others, all health held equal, and this might be one of the processes by which relationship formation, why we see homophily, or we see this homogeneity in um, to you. The really attractive people say, nah, I can do better. So you these processes that the attractive people can afford to be more picky, and the most attractive person you can get. So it's not a very flattering picture, I suppose, but it's kind of a funny one. How is it then that people actually define attractiveness? This would be better if we actually had a class to show you this sort of thing. But what you can Okay. We had a little bit of an